Hey guys, GhazzyTV here with another Path of Exile video. In this one, we're going to talk about the 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum patch notes, TLDR, the things that stood out the most for me personally. I do want to take this opportunity to talk about a few quick things before we dive into the video. One of the things is obviously going to be the fact that I will be tackling a little bit of information about the TLDR on the state of minions in this video as well. I just noticed that we are currently sitting on 62.6k subscribers. I was hoping we could actually reach 70,000 subscribers before the league releases. So if you're watching this video or you like the content you're watching, dude, I actually appreciate if you hit the subscribe button and like the video as well. It helps the YouTube algorithm. Besides that, the 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum offered a lot of information that are really cool in terms of things like Hexes. The curse changes there are very interesting, but I'm going to take out a couple things that stood out the most for me, and I'm going to leave the link in the descriptions below to the actual patch notes that I would strongly recommend to read if you want to look into things that might have stood out more than it did for you, or for me, sorry. So this is the TLDR things that I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to start with the Mark versus Hex curses. Finally, a good check to do. So what's really interesting with the Hex changes, which we had a big manifesto about, was actually the fact that they've reduced or removed entirely, actually, the curse effectiveness reduction from Hex curses from both rare enemies as well as unique enemies. Rares had a 33% reduction of the curses affected on them when they were Hex curses, whilst unique enemies, including pinnacle endgame bosses, had a 66% reduction. These things are no longer going to be there, and they've also adjusted the curses to be in line with this, with a lot of other changes. The details will be in the patch notes, of course. What makes this very interesting is the fact that now we'll actually have to compare Mark curses versus Hex curses to verify which curse you would like to use the most, if not both, for example. Before this, we would almost always choose to run Mark curse versus bosses because of the drastically lowered efficiency these Hex curses had versus unique bosses. This has been changed. On top of this, they've also made it so that both Enfeeble as well as Temporal Chains are actually surprisingly amazing as defensive layers of curses versus unique bosses. Personally, I think this will be more of a hardcore kind of league approach thing to use, but it actually is good enough to be something you might want to think about, at least in the softcore environment. So I think that's a really crazy cool thing to see. There's one little thing I want to talk about that was a little bit upsetting, and that was the Primordial Jewels information. Now, there's a lot of things happening to unique jewels, and the only information that we have when it comes to the Primordial Jewels was that they will not be accessible through a vendor recipe, but they are now supposedly more deterministic. Now, I'm the kind of person that I think that deterministic is when something is actually deterministic. You can't have more or less deterministic, but you can have more or less, higher or lower probability. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. I can only speculate, and to avoid sitting here speculating out of my ass, I'm just not going to do that. But I think there was a lack of information regarding this. On the other hand, it lets us find out ourselves. There's probably going to be some Reddit posts and some information across the board when we find out where these jewels actually are deterministically farmable, I guess. Besides that, there was a lot of unique item updates, and I think it's very important that when providing opinions or information about things, that one should only speak from a perspective or point of view of experience. So the items that stood out for me are items that I have personal experience with, that I can actually talk about. Therefore, there's quite a few items that looked really good that I think will actually be very nice for the sake of the change they've done. However, since I don't have that much experience with them, I've chosen not to mention those items. So the ones that I have chosen, I have a direct experience with. And first off, it's the Etsyri's Disfavor. Now, it's been confirmed that this will drop from Uber Etsyri herself. And this weapon, they just made it an absolute beast now. It's absolutely crazy. And it's something that I personally love to use on my Animate Guardian in a build with Chains of Command. And when you look at the Etsyri's Disfavor, when it comes to the stats that it has, they went to go from a +2 level socket of support gems to removing that and adding a ton more damage to the item, as well as giving +10 weapon range instead of +2. And that's not it. They're also adding 30% quality of socket of support gems, which I'm assuming is to take over this role for this modifier. I think this is absolutely crazy. And it goes in line with the thing that most of us streamers have been talking about for a very long time, with the idea that the uniques or the big items that you drop from bosses, they are items that you wouldn't even use to kill that boss. That's how bad they are. Now we're actually presented with an option where these items are so good that you would definitely want to use them even after being able to kill that specific boss. This favor is definitely in this category and is very, very good with the weapon range. I mean, I can only imagine, you know, Cyclone Pills or whatever you want to play with this. Actually looks crazy how good this is. However, something that actually isn't in the patch notes is that Chris Wilson in the reveal stream said that these items, or at least some of the items, would be closer to the rarity of Meixsell and Headhunter. That means like tier 1, tier 0 unique kind of drop rate on these. But the thing is, some of these items, such as the Starforge, Voidforge, or Disfavor, they are boss-specific unique drops. So the actual percent chance of dropping these, we don't know. Either way. Another item is the Divinarius dagger I wanted to talk about as well. And Divinarius went from 50 to 70% spell damage to having 100 to 150 spell damage, and they're having a ton extra life and mana on kill. I'm not a big fan of that specific modifiers myself, but they also provide a ton more, almost twice as much increased critical strike chance with spells if you have killed recently, as well as critical strike multiplier for spells if you haven't killed recently, which was from 40 to 60 to 60 to 100%. Now, this is actually not going to compete with the big end-game rare items, of course. However, this is insanely good for things like totem builds, where you as a player actually never does the kills. Therefore, you can have the generic spell damage, you can have the critical strike multiplier. It's just absolutely crazy how cool some of these upgrades have been, or the updates of these unique items specifically. I really like it, and I hope to see a lot of builds being using these. And that also brings me to another topic on the spectrum. The problem with these changes is that it presents not just boons or buffs for everybody, with the downside of it being rarer or therefore also more expensive in trade leagues, but it also presents us with a situation where the unique items will obviously be more favorable to use over rare items, which, depending on how rare some of these items are, if some of these are somewhat rare, common or less used, they will be more attractive for a lot of people to use instead of rares, which will obviously impact the desire or the value or interest, even in many cases, for the rare items that drops instead. So hopefully these items will be so rare that they will not compete with the rare equivalents, if you will. So we'll see how that goes. I'm actually very excited about these drops and these changes. The next item is obviously the Kingmaker. Now, when it comes to Kingmaker, it just got a generic damage buff, which means that we do have to talk about the Soul Taker, which is how you make a Kingmaker. Soul Taker got a pretty significant damage buff, especially on the flat damage. This is actually crazy good, especially with the other modifiers the Soul Taker brings to the table as well. And they made the rarity very, very rare in comparison to what we have right now. Now, the problem I have with this change is not so much that it's really good for the melee builds. I think that's a really good change. The problem is that this will indirectly affect minion builds. And the reason for this is because Kingmaker is an item that we use a lot for the sake of the Culling Strike, but also fortification, not just the crit multi, but mostly the fortification and the Culling Strike. By using that on the Animate Guardian, that will now be expected to be very, very expensive. So we'll see what happens there. Either way, there are other options thanks to the Hex Curse changes for us to use something like Dying Breath, which was not affected in the patch notes. Dying Breath itself has an increased effect of enemies having increased effect of curses on them, allowing us to further scale our curse effectiveness with Hex Curses. This allows us to do even better efficiency versus these targets. So maybe Dying Breath will not be that bad after all with the curse changes that is about to happen. Small note on the Hex Curse that I didn't mention is, of course, that the automation of curses has been reduced in efficiency so that it is more interesting or better interactive, or an interesting gameplay, if you will, to self-cast the curses rather than automating them. So that's something that's going to be very interesting to see how many people will choose to automate versus not automating them, depending on how the numbers will look once we are able to update the path of building and can start filling with the details of the builds. The other item I want to talk about is actually Starforge. Now, Starforge got an insane buff as well, from 200 to 300 up to 400 to 450 fist damage instead. Keep in mind that Starforge cannot deal elemental damage, but it allows your physical damage to actually shock, which is one of the crazy things. Starforge is insane how good it is. And they did the similar change on Voidforge by removing the increased physical damage, but also more than doubling the amount of percent of the weapon physical damage that's gained as extra damage of a random element, and allowing the elemental damage done with these weapons, or this weapon, to actually shock. Similar to the Starforge by the elemental equivalent, I think this is crazy cool, and both Voidforge and Starforge and the combination of at Sirius's favor is very interesting for me personally, as I'm a big fan of things like Chains of Command with the Enemy Guardian. So it's going to be really fun to try to POB out which of these three will be the most optimal choice for that kind of build. And I think that these changes will actually make it very interesting for the actual builds that want to use it on their characters to actually make builds around, because they're very interesting, unique, and always been pretty cool. So it's fun to see that they're getting such significant buffs to actually be interesting and nice to use, on top of actually being valuable items for people to farm and sell as well in the trade environment leagues. Voltaxic Rift actually got a really nice change I did not expect, and that is reverting the change they did 6 years ago back in 2.5 Prophecy League, I believe it was, where they cut down the conversion from Lightning to Chaos down from 100% to 60. They are reworking this back to 100%. So now we'll actually be able to do full Chaos conversion with Lightning damage by using this bow, which offers a lot of options when it comes to different types of builds you want to use that does Lightning damage into converting that to Chaos. They also significantly buffed the actual damage that it's doing from the bow as well, but doesn't have the chance to shock it anymore. I think this is a crazy cool change, and I always like the idea of these conversions and the different types of build approaches that these changes presents to people in the build playing with these items. And the things with Voltaxic Rift is that you can actually utilize this for something like spell-based builds as well. So that's very fun. I'm actually very excited about that. And we did tackle the Voidforge. The other things that stood out, and I do apologize for talking fast. I don't want to prolong this video too much. I'm going to go through the notes I picked out as fast as I can here. If you want to check the details, again, links in the description. Lightning Strike. Well, Lightning Strike got, how to put it, massacred. The projectiles went from having 7 projectiles at level 20 to having 2 across the board. They also don't have the quality for increased damage, and the quality from the Divergent version does not have the extra projectiles. Instead, that has an increased chance to shock anymore. And then you have the Labyrinth Helmet enchant went from going up to 3 projectiles in the Uber version, and now the values will be merciless, or the Merc version will have 1 and the Uber version will have 2. So essentially what happened is that the Lightning Strike is completely dead, like completely shit on. And this goes hand in hand with another change we're going to talk about later, and that is the Nightblade support with keeping Elusive buff up consistently, because it will no longer work with Withering Step and the Nightblade. So I just feel like they just completely decimated Lightning Strike, and it's absolutely crazy. The other part I want to talk about that's actually really cool is Onslaught. Now, Onslaught got buffed significantly, because now Onslaught is a buff, and this is a buff. Makes sense, right? So basically, in the past, Onslaught has always been a case of you having a modifier on you that says, hey, you have Onslaught, so you get this and that modifier that affects you now. That's it. Now they're making this a buff, and what that means is that it will actually be affected by things that affect buffs. So if you have a Silver Flask, they will now be able to roll modifiers that increases the efficiency of those of the buff, which also means it's a buff to Meixsell. But this is so cool because you can now scale the efficiency that you get from the Onslaught itself to be even stronger. I think this is a crazy cool change. Not every build uses it, but it's definitely a really cool change, and I really like that. Pious Path got nerfed. We don't have to talk about it too much, but basically the change to it is that the Consecrated Ground no longer will give you 50% increased effect across the ground that you create, which obviously has some downsides for the Inquisitors. However, Pox himself said that this is not a big deal for the Inquisitor's Righteous Fire builds, and trust me when I say trust him when he says it's not a big deal for those builds. It's not going to be a big deal for our Righteous Fire builds. So that's all I have to say about that. Melee Splash on the tree is very interesting. They are making it so that the mastery change and the melee changes are getting some pretty cool, interesting mechanical approaches. I believe it was the Tribal Fury node is now changed to no longer having the strike skill hitting additional target. Instead, it makes it so melee strike skills. Keep in mind it's strike skills. Deal splash damage to surrounding targets. And they will also be having the strike skill hitting additional target is now moved from the Tribal Fury into a mastery option for the attack masteries. This is something that I think is a really good step in the right direction when it comes to how masteries are introduced to the game, because the initial plan with masteries was to take away interesting modifiers from the notables on the tree and allowing us to choose them from the mastery sections instead, to generate a situation where we're able to not be forced into certain aspects of the tree with the build you're playing. Problem is that they've actually failed very hard on a lot of this by not introducing all of these interesting notables as mastery choices, because a lot of them were taken away. As a quick example, we can talk about the Enduring Bond, which had a modifier saying that Raiding Spirits had a % chance of refreshing its duration when hitting a rare unique target, and we expected that to be introduced as a mastery option for minion builds. It is not. The problem, though, is that this was on a node that gives you minion damage for minions that have a duration, which means that in the current state of our skill tree that we have in the game, every build that has a duration-based minion that wants to use them for main damage has to go for that node either way. So essentially, the only thing that was interesting with that node was taken away, and we don't have an option to get it anywhere else. So it didn't do anything other than taking away the only interesting part of it. There's a lot of these options done across the board. A lot for elemental builds is there as well. Differences between elementals such as fire, lightning, and cold, of course. So I'm not very happy with those things in the current iteration of masteries for the most part, but I think that for the melee, with the changes they've done with the Tribal Fury, is really interesting. I like this change. It's definitely, in my case, a step in the right direction when it comes to that topic. Moving on, we have the Withering Step, like I mentioned earlier as well. The problem with this was that the Withering Step could be used to keep up a far stronger elusive effect on average, especially in combination with the Nightblade support. Normally you have to wait for elusive to gradually lose effectiveness and fall off before you can gain elusive, and the way they're going to solve this is that Withering Step can just not be used while you have elusive. So as long as you have elusive, the Withering Step will no longer be able to be used until the elusive is completely gone. This is obviously a direct nerf to this combination of modifiers. There are some builds that are not using this specifically to abuse it that hard that will obviously lose some defensive layers because of this. You know, F's in chat for those people, I'm sorry, but I think that this is a good change in general. Tainted Orb Refusings, there is a lot of changes with this. A lot of changes with the Tainted Orb Refusings. Basically, there's been a lot of complaints about the average odds chance of you getting losing or gaining a link on a corrupted item using these fusings. They are now changing the outcome odds for them to be more favorable, to match where they were in the Scourge League, at which point it was very nice. A lot of people used them specifically to get 6 things rather than using their own fusings on items, so they didn't have to corrupt their items. I like this change, but it also means that we're definitely going to be seeing a lot of people wanting to purchase the Tainted Fusings, which will increase the attractiveness and value of the Tainted Orb Fusings. And I think it's really good for Soul Self-Found, but I'm going to try to keep my opinions regulated towards the Trade League, as that's where I'm playing. The majority of the player base is there as well. Other changes are the beast capture changes. So when it comes to the bestiary changes, party play changes in this is that instead of having a guaranteed captured beast for everyone in the party, it's only guaranteed to the map owner. Besides this, the other up to 5 people you can have in your party will only have a chance of gaining that beast. Now, obviously, this will impact the party play a bit and make it more leveled out playing field for the solo players, and I think that's a good change in that sense. I don't think this will combat the botter/cheaters who have found a way of workaround when it comes to the previous change it did to party play beast capturing, which was actually to create a radius. I think it's up to 2 screens away from where the beast is. Any player within 2 screens, and when it's captured, gets the beast. This was not the case in the past. It was just enough to have the players inside the actual map. So some people actually multi-boxed a bunch of accounts, placed them in their fucking map, and cleared the map with their main character, and all of their characters got the beast, and that's how they basically got a ton of extra beasts. This is still a problem in the community, and I know this because of the way I crafted the game, and it's just sad to see, but I definitely think that this is a good change, and I hope that they consistently and continue their work on combating these type of botters, and I know that they are, because I know people that I've been buying beasts from that are suddenly banned, so I know that it's actually happening, and I'm very happy about that. But I think this is a good change in terms of creating a leveled playing field between party players as well as solo players, and I like that approach. Even though party players have their perks of, you know, playing with a friend and whatnot, I think this is a good leveling play field for everyone involved. Kirak unique map offers got actually nerfed. This was rather interesting because the thing is that they offered the rather rare uniques maps too frequently than they should, apparently. So basically what they've done is that they've lowered his chances to offer the more rare unique maps to be more reasonable. What that means is all we can say is that they nerfed the chance for rare uniques. That's all we can say. I'm not a big, I don't have a big problem with this because I normally end up with way too many of these re-rolling Kirak mission items anyways, and they're just going to gather dust in my stash either way, so I don't think this is a problem. Personally, I like it. I don't think it's going to matter too much, but I figured it should be mentioned. And then that kind of covers the things that I think stood out the most for me in the patch notes. Again, link in the description. Read the patch notes. There's a lot there. I'm sure there are things that stood out for you more than it did for me. And I'm going to tackle the end of this video by talking about the state of minions. In the patch notes, there was a mention of minions 7 times. 3 of which was in bug fixes, 2 of which was in Eldritch minion changes, and 1 of them was actually for the Profane Bloom. So there was only 1 mention that was actually for an actual minion that we players can use, and that is the fact that Divergent Skeletons will now have the quality change from the 2 Dust Jewel, where you get a cooldown on the summon skeletons but can summon more skeleton warriors per click or per summon. That's it. That's all the mentions we have on minions. So where does this bring us when it comes to the state of minions in 3.20? The biggest issue in 3.19 was the survivability of minions, and therefore the problem we had was that we had to put a lot of our investments towards keeping them alive. I think that it would still be preferable to go for 8+ maximum elemental resistance mastery for the minion defense mastery, which will be reflected in my build guides as I'll be updating them all for the leading into 3.20. Do check them out in the guide hub, link in the descriptions as per usual. So I don't think that we're going to have any major issues with that because of the removal of Arch Nemesis. Besides that, I think that generally speaking, the only thing that I would like to see is a slight damage buff to minions. I would like to see a better crafting approach, and I would like to see some better improvements when it comes to the +2 helmet. But since none of these are actually things that will happen with based on the patch notes we just read, the state of minions is this. It's going to be easier for us to keep them alive, which means that we can focus more of our investments towards actual damage nodes for the minions rather than actual defensive nodes. You can choose to neglect some of the defensive stats for them to focus more on offense. So clearing with minions, the meta minions that we've seen in the previous league, such as the Absolution or SRS, will work very fine. Our Akali's Fang will do more than fine. And we're definitely going to see some other niche builds, such as speed clearing with Dancing Dervish, despite the lack of AI control on that, which is still awful. I still think that minions will be in a very good state. However, I don't think that minions will be as good as they used to be before 3.19. But on the other hand, the league mechanic, and the way it's presented from what we've seen, it definitely seems like minions will be one of the top builds you can use as a newer player or a casual player for a smooth playthrough, utilizing minions for the sake of these encounters, because of the fact that the resolve mechanic will kick you out of the Sanctum and not allow you to progress any further, and you'll have to restart your progress on the next Sanctum. Therefore, having builds that allows you to move your enemies away from you and having your damage output without having to click all the time allows you to focus more on the approach of actually dodging these well-telegraphed abilities. Obviously, with a lot of minions, visual clarity might be a problem, but it should still be a lot easier to controllably progress through the Sanctum with totem builds, minion builds, or if you're a person that plays the game a lot, if you get a high amount of damage and high mobility, I think that will be fine as well. But I firmly believe that for newer players and casual players, minions and totems are probably going to be 2 of the best builds you can utilize for the league mechanic. I'll be talking about this in a separate video, probably posting tonight or tomorrow. Guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this little rant and TLDR version of the patch notes, what stood out the most for me. Again, I'd appreciate anyone hitting the subscribe button. It does help out the channel a lot, so I appreciate everyone doing that. Hit the like button, leave a comment below what you guys think of the patch notes, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Till then, stay safe, keep rocking.